Title was absolute. Commands traveled across 3 continents. Legions moved when the emperor spoke. Yet the most immediate threat often waited in silence, inside the same walls that promised safety. A guarded doorway could become a snare. A salute in the corridor could conceal a decision already made. In the crisis of the 3rd century, emperors learned that the distance between sovereign authority and sudden collapse could be measured in steps. Maximinus Thrax had been raised by soldiers and guarded by soldiers. Carinus had worn the purple with the full machinery of empire behind him. Neither was ultimately undone by a foreign king at a distant frontier. The decisive hands belonged to men who stood close enough to study an emperor's habits: guards, officers, courtiers, and rivals who moved within the imperial orbit. The empire could still defeat enemies abroad, but it struggled to survive the enemies it generated at home. Conspiracies did not always begin with ideology or grand designs. They began with fear of punishment, anger at discipline, hunger for donatives, and the suspicion that someone else had promised more. A whisper became a certainty. A certainty became a plotted removal. In an age when succession had no agreed anchor, the emperor's protectors could become the agents of his downfall, and the state's greatest office could be reduced to a wager, settled by force. Rome's crisis did not spring from a single shock. It grew out of a long history in which coercion had repeatedly been allowed to decide legitimacy. In the capital, power rarely belonged to speeches in the Senate House or to the weight of marble temples. It belonged to armed men positioned at the hinge points of the imperial system, at palace gates, in barracks, and in command tents where orders were issued and where the next emperor might be proclaimed. The Praetorian Guard had begun as an honor and a safeguard, selected to stand as the emperor's shield at the center of the world. Their appearance in ceremony promised order. Their presence could calm crowds, intimidate rivals, and reassure a city that feared the unpredictability of politics. But their true advantage lay in proximity. The guard stood where decisions were made and where emperors slept. In that closeness, protection and opportunity became difficult to separate. Rome learned early what it meant when protectors became arbiters. In the 1st century, Caligula was assassinated by men from within his own circle, and Claudius was elevated not by a deliberate constitutional act, but by soldiers who found him and decided he would rule. The precedent mattered. Once the imperial office could be granted by armed hands in the palace, it could be taken away by the same logic. That knowledge never vanished. It waited beneath later stability like a buried weapon. By the late 2nd century, survival increasingly came with a price tag. Donatives, once celebratory gifts, hardened into expectations, payments made to keep loyalty intact, and blades sheathed. Emperors learned that affection was unreliable, but wages could be increased. That bargain corroded the state from both ends. To buy the army's goodwill, rulers strained the treasury, taxed harder, and debased coinage. Those measures fed resentment in the provinces and accelerated the sense that the empire was being consumed to finance its own security. A guard accustomed to payment did not become faithful. It became expensive, and once loyalty had a market value, it invited bidding. The year 193 turned this dynamic into spectacle. Pertinax, elevated after the violent end of Commodus, attempted to restore discipline and restrain the guard's expectations. The response was immediate and decisive. He was put to death inside the palace. Rome then witnessed an act so brazen it damaged the idea of imperial legitimacy itself. The throne was effectively auctioned to Didius Julius. The shock was not merely that an emperor could be removed. It was that the highest office could be treated as property, transferred by cash and armed consent. Septimius Severus marched on Rome, punished those responsible, and disbanded and replaced the Praetorians, as if excising an infection. Yet the memory of 193 could not be disbanded. The empire had seen the throne sold by those appointed to guard it, and that memory clung to later decades. Even when emperors tried to impose order, the underlying lesson remained. Proximity to the ruler carried the power to end him, and soldiers could regard emperorship as something they could grant, revoke, and renegotiate out. When the crisis of the 3rd century arrived, it came less as a single catastrophe than as a habit of internal coercion that spread from palace corridors to frontier camps. It was not only Rome's center that became unstable. The very method by which emperors were chosen, by acclaim, intimidation, and rapid shifts of allegiance, began to devour the state. Maximinus Thrax rose from the hard world of the frontier. He was a soldier emperor, shaped in barracks rather than in senatorial ceremony. In 235 the army elevated him, and that elevation carried a warning. The empire's supreme office could now be made where weapons and paymasters were closest, not where laws were oldest. In the eyes of many, Rome's traditional center weakened. The empire's heart began to beat in camps and on marching roads. Maximinus ruled like a man who expected treachery, because the age had taught him to. He demanded money, demanded obedience, and leaned on intimidation as a tool of government. But intimidation dulled with overuse. It exhausted those subjected to it, and isolated the man who relied upon it. Resentment gathered in layers. Among senators he distrusted. Among provincials he drained for revenue. And among soldiers who understood that the same hands that raised an emperor could also withdraw support. Power acquired through coercion required constant reinforcement, and constant reinforcement made the emperor appear perpetually in conflict with his own base. As pressure intensified, the pattern of the age emerged with harsh clarity. When governors and aristocrats sensed weakness, they reached for the purple. In Africa, Gordian I and II were proclaimed amid local upheaval. Their moment was brief and their fall swift, and the speed of their collapse only deepened Rome's panic. The Senate, desperate and frightened, named Pupienus and Balbinus as co-emperors, attempting to manufacture stability through shared authority. Yet shared authority did not automatically produce unity. It could just as easily produce rivalry, mutual suspicion, and competing patronage networks. Inside the capital, the Praetorian Guard watched senatorial maneuvering with contempt. Pupienus, stern and experienced, tried to restrain them. Balbinus sought compromise. Between them lay distrust, and the Guard exploited it. The end came not at the frontier, but in the palace itself. The Praetorians forced their way in, seized the emperors, and put them to death, in a demonstration meant to be understood. Rome did not simply lose to rulers. It was compelled again to acknowledge that the Guard's will could eclipse the Senate's, and that the palace could devour its occupants. A boy, Gordian III, was placed on the throne. His youth made him useful to competing interests, pliable, steerable, and therefore safer at least temporarily, for those who wanted influence without the threat of an emperor with an independent base. The selection revealed what had become normal. The empire faced enemies on the Rhine and Euphrates, but it also faced an internal succession system that invited armed men to decide outcomes, because no other mechanism could reliably impose consensus. From there, the crisis widened. Disloyalty no longer belonged only to the Praetorians as an institution. It seeped into every circle where proximity to authority could be leveraged. The court became a contest of factions, advisors, relatives, senatorial cliques, and commanders whose loyalty lasted as long as advantage. What should have protected the emperor became a maze in which personal survival often outweighed public order. Decius, proclaimed in 249, attempted to restore a stern Roman severity. He pursued reform and demanded sacrifice to the traditional gods, seeking unity through ancient ritual and discipline. But unity could not be commanded into existence when legitimacy was brittle and the empire's wounds were structural. His reign was marked by war and insecurity, and it ended at Abritus, where he fell in combat against the Goths. Ancient sources differed in emphasis. Some framed his end as noble persistence, others suggested failure and poor judgment, and later rumor drifted toward insinuations that political enemies might have benefited from his ruin. The debate over motive could not change the consequence. An emperor was lost on campaign. The shock of his fall rippled back to Rome, and the empire's confidence in its own permanence weakened again. Trebonian's Gallus took power in the aftermath. Amid panic and exhaustion, the Danube frontier remained volatile, plague spread, and the currency continued to weaken. In such conditions, even ordinary misfortune became politically radioactive. Later accounts accused Gallus of failing to avenge Decius, even of profiting from disaster claims, difficult to verify and shaped by hostile tradition. Yet, in Roman politics, belief could be more dangerous than proof. The suspicion that an emperor might have advanced through another's catastrophe taught soldiers and senators to interpret defeat as intrigue and to treat loyalty as conditional. The politics of suspicion produced its own momentum. Aemilianus, a commander on the Danube, was proclaimed by his troops and marched against Gallus. Gallus went to meet him, and before the contest could be settled in open battle, Gallus and his son were killed by their own soldiers. Their men calculated that allegiance to a doomed emperor was a fast path to ruin. Survival became arithmetic. Serve the likely victor, abandon the likely fallen. In that arithmetic, betrayal was not an exceptional act. It was a rational choice within a collapsing system. Valerian rose next, an older senator-emperor, attempting to impose order through shared rule with his son Gallienus. The arrangement promised continuity, but it also exposed the empire's basic weakness. A divided leadership could be interpreted as a divided authority, and division invited challenge. Usurpers appeared like sparks in dry grass. The empire's scale made the problem worse. An emperor could not be everywhere at once. Every absence created a vacuum, and each vacuum offered ambitious men the chance to claim necessity as justification for rebellion. Valerian's fate became one of Rome's deepest humiliations. In the east, he fought the Sasanian Persians under Shapur. The first plague weakened his ranks. Pressure mounted on the frontier, and Rome's room for maneuver narrowed. The disaster followed. Valerian was captured alive by a foreign king. Ancient accounts varied in detail, and later Roman narratives may have heightened the shame to magnify Persian cruelty. But the central fact remained. The emperor of Rome became a prisoner. A state that had once paraded chained monarchs now had to endure the spectacle, however, reported of its own ruler taken. This was more than an external defeat. It was a consequence of internal fragility. Valerian had been forced into desperate campaigning in a world where political instability and repeated usurpations drained resources and attention. His capture did not arrive as an isolated misfortune. It landed on an empire already bleeding trust, where every failure intensified the belief that the center could not protect the whole. Gallienus left to hold what remained, faced the impossible. He fought along the Rhine and Danube, confronted revolts, and attempted reforms to the army's command structure. Yet every effort ran into a grim paradox. Competence itself became dangerous. Each victory elevated commanders who earned troops' devotion, and each commander with devotion became a plausible emperor. In such a system, the state punished skill by making it politically threatening. The emperor needed effective generals, but effective generals made the emperor vulnerable. Disloyalty therefore became not merely a moral collapse, but a method of advancement and self-preservation. It removed rivals, preempted perceived reprisals, and reallocated the future toward those quickest to act. The palace was no longer the sole theater of this coercion. The logic traveled with the court and the army. A headquarters tent could become a throne room, and an officer's circle could become the venue for an enforced succession. As emperors were eliminated or displaced, the frontiers did not pause. In the west, a breakaway state emerged, the so-called Gallic Empire, beginning under Postumus in 260. It was not rebellion for its own sake, so much as a claim born of desperation. If the center could not provide consistent defense, then the edges sought authority that could. Postumus offered local stability and protection, at least to those willing to accept his rule, and his existence advertised Rome's weakening hold. In the east, the story took a different shape. Palmyra, a wealthy caravan city, rose as Roman authority faltered. After Valerian's capture, the eastern provinces needed leadership that could respond quickly to Persian pressure. Odenathus of Palmyra acted as Rome's champion, fighting Persia and restoring order in the east, formerly loyal to Rome, yet increasingly powerful in fact. After his death, Zenobia carried Palmyra toward open independence, claiming power with imperial grandeur. These secessions were not isolated accidents. They were symptoms of an empire in which the center could no longer guarantee continuity, because its own rulers could not reliably survive the politics around them. Gallienus continued to fight on multiple fronts, attempting to suppress usurpers while holding borders. It was the kind of war without a clean end, because its source was not a single enemy, but the empire's political structure. He suppressed some revolts, negotiated others, and tried to impose a more professional command system. Yet he could not reform the belief that mattered most, the belief among soldiers that they could decide the occupant of the throne, whenever circumstances allowed. At Milan, while campaigning against a rival, Gallienus was assassinated by conspirators within his own command. Ancient sources disagreed on the precise cast of plotters, but the outcome was unmistakable. The emperor fell not to an external enemy but to violence inside a Roman camp. The old palace danger had expanded outward across the empire's military geography. The closer the emperor came to the instruments of power, the closer he came to men who could turn those instruments on him. Claudius II followed. later praised as Gothicus for victories against the Goths. His reign brought a brief sense of restoration through military success, but it was short, likely ended by plague. Even an emperor's natural death did not necessarily restore stability. When reigns ended quickly, whether by disease, battle, or assassination, the vacuum returned, and with it, the scramble that made every succession feel provisional and contested. Aurelian rose next, a commander of iron discipline and relentless energy. Where others had merely tried to survive, he seized initiative. He reconquered what had broken away, first the Palmyrene East, then the Gallic West. His campaigns did more than redraw borders. They reasserted the idea that the center could still act decisively. He built walls around Rome itself, a stark admission that the capital was no longer beyond fear, and that the empire's internal instability had made even the city vulnerable. His reforms aimed to reimpose authority over a world that had begun to live as if Rome were optional. For a moment, the crisis appeared to bend. Aurelian's victories created the nearest thing to resurgence the empire had seen in years. Yet the same forces that had destroyed weaker emperors did not vanish in the presence of a stronger one. Success intensified discipline. Discipline intensified fear. Fear sharpened the impulse to strike first. Aurelian did not fall in battle. He fell to a conspiracy born within his own staff. Ancient accounts described a secretary accused or expecting punishment, who forged a list of names and convinced officers that the emperor intended to execute them. Whether every detail of the story survived intact or became shaped by retelling, its logic fit the age. Men who believed they were marked chose a preemptive strike. Somewhere on the road, away from the theater of grand victories and far from enemy lines, the restorer of the world was assassinated by those closest to him. The episode exposed the empire's central tragedy. Even success could not protect a ruler when the political system trained the powerful to fear proximity to authority. In an environment where purges were plausible and loyalty was transactional, suspicion could move faster than any army. The throne remained both prize and peril, and the imperial court remained a place where information, real or forged, could become a weapon. What followed was a grim procession that revealed how little had been truly cured. Tacitus became emperor, an elderly senator elevated amid uncertainty, and died shortly after. Accounts varied, with some suggesting illness and others hinting at foul play. Probus, a capable soldier emperor, won victories and attempted to employ soldiers in civilian labor when campaigns ended, seeking to rebuild provinces rather than merely strip them. The army answered with resentment. Probus was killed by mutinous troopsmen who preferred familiar privileges to discipline and construction. Carinus rose and then died, under circumstances reported differently by ancient writers. Perhaps illness, perhaps accident, perhaps a storm later mythologized into divine judgment. The details remained elusive, but the instability did not. Near the end of this long tunnel stood Carinus. By the early 280s, the Praetorian Guard still mattered, but the broader phenomenon had outgrown any single unit. Palace officials, court factions, and military officers across the empire had absorbed the lesson that 193 had made unforgettable. Emperors could be replaced. Carinus faced Diocletian, a rival proclaimed in the east. On the field near the Margus River in 285, Carinus's cause collapsed, not solely by arms but by internal defection. Later tradition claimed he was assassinated by an officer whose family honor Carinus had insulted, a story repeated because it matched the moral preferences of Roman writers. The exact motive remained debated, but the essential point did not change. Carinus died at the hands of his own side, and his removal ended the contest. In Rome, as in so many moments of that century, the decisive blow came from within. From Maximinus Thrax to Carinus, the pattern completed itself with relentless consistency. Emperors were not merely defeated by external enemies, they were consumed by the politics of their protectors and peers. The problem once associated with the Praetorians metastasized into an imperial condition, a crisis of legitimacy in which the throne lacked an agreed path of succession and therefore invited armed arbitration. The cost was not only loss of life, it was the slow corrosion of trust. Emperors began to live like men under siege inside their own households. They watched guards who stood too quietly and listened to advisors who spoke too smoothly. They measured generals by ambition as much as by talent. They offered donatives to buy time, then offered more when time ran out. They promoted commanders because the frontiers required competence, then feared those same commanders for becoming indispensable. They punished treachery and created new enemies in the act. In such a climate, suspicion was not a private flaw. It was a survival technique demanded by the environment. This instability produced a brutal selection. Statesmanship became less valuable than ruthlessness. The emperor who hesitated could be labeled weak. The emperor who trusted could be exploited. The emperor who reformed too sharply could provoke those who lost privileges. Those who lasted tended to be men of harsh discipline, quick suspicion, and military strength, qualities that could hold a frontier line, but could also harden the empire into something more guarded than it had been. Rome emerged from the crisis of the 3rd century, altered in its bones. The Senate's prestige diminished further, while the army's role in politics became an open fact, rather than a whispered influence. The imperial court grew more ceremonial and more distant, an attempt to place layers of ritual and bureaucracy between the ruler and the nearest weapon. In time, reforms would seek to break the old cycle by restructuring command and attempting to make the throne less accessible to the closest armed faction. Yet even reform carried memory within it, the knowledge that closeness to power could mean power over fate, and that an emperor's shield could become an instrument of removal. The crisis was often remembered through its dramatic horizons: Goths on the Danube, Persians in the east, breakaway realms in Gaul and Palmyra. Beneath those visible threats ran a quieter and more destructive conflict inside the Roman system itself. The empire had withstood enemies for centuries because it knew how to fight them. What it could not easily withstand was the collapse of certainty about succession, about loyalty, about what the purple robe meant when armed men treated it as a prize to be transferred. In 193, Rome watched guards put Pertinax to death and auction the world. That year did not merely stay in a moment. It trained an empire to believe that power was purchasable and transferable by force. When later emperors fell, Maximinus to mutiny, Puppinus and Balbinus eliminated in the palace, Gallus abandoned by his own men, Gallienus struck down in a camp, Aurelian assassinated by frightened officers, Probus removed by Carinus lost to betrayal. Legend echoed that earlier lesson, louder each time, until the echo became the sound of an age. No ruler, however mighty, stood above the fragile mathematics of fear and reward. An emperor could command legions and still be undone by a rumor moving through a barracks, a forged list passed in secret, a guard counting coins, or a rival promising more. Rome's enemies did not always need to breach walls when gatekeepers could be bribed, threatened, or convinced that striking first was safer than waiting. The empire's most lethal frontier was not the Rhine, nor the Euphrates, nor the deserts of Syria. It was the narrow space between the ruler and the men sworn to keep him alive. In that space, Rome lost emperor after emperor, and the state learned again and again that the greatest danger to the purple could stand in uniform at the emperor's side.